Welcome to the Kirtland Safety Society Bank Crisis video. Pictured above we have the Kirtland Temple, and to the left of it we have the Kirtland Bank shown in this lithograph. I think this is all we have as far as pictures of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. Okay, and also pictured above we kind of have a map of Kirtland. You can see the Kirtland Temple there, number 19. Safety Society was nearby, Kirtland Safety Society Bank there, number 39. So let's go over this first slide here. This is from a book called Zion in the Courts, which came out in 2001, written by two law professors, University of Utah law professor Edwin B. Firmage and a Creighton University law professor R. Colin Mangrum. Pretty good book, and they talk a little bit about this crisis. They say nothing in Ohio injured the reputation of the prophet Joseph more than the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. Nothing injured his reputation more. This is definitely something Joseph Smith shouldn't have gotten involved in. Hostility often surfaced in the form of litigation against the prophet. All right, same source here. Criminal action stemming from violations of state banking laws presented the most serious threat to Joseph's status in Kirtland. So these two law professors saying he violated state banking laws. Pictured above, we have a $100 Kirtland Safety Society Bank note. You can see who had signed it here. Joseph Smith was cashier who signed it. Sidney Rigdon was president of this bank, and he also signed it. I heard someone say, another historian say, that Joseph Smith didn't sign all these himself. I think he had W.W. Phelps sign for him, but still, it's his name on there, and also Rigdon's. Okay, Firmage and Mangrum continue in the same book, Zion in the Courts. One must conclude from a consideration of the failure of the Kirtland Safety Society that Mormon leadership exhibited extraordinarily bad judgment and poor understanding or concern over the banking laws. Pictured above, we have a sign in Kirtland, Ohio, from the Community of Christ. Maybe they own this spot where the Kirtland Safety Society Bank was. I don't think the building is there anymore. Okay, a little bit of information from a new book that just came out by Cleveland State University history and religion professor Stephen C. Taysom, pictured above. Like a Fiery Meteor, The Life of Joseph F. Smith, 2023, cover pictured on the right here. This looks to be a really good book that I've only read small parts of so far. But anyway, Taysom says the church suffered a major financial scandal as a result of the Kirtland Safety Society's collapse, and church membership became polarized. Not for the last time, previously stalwart followers took Joseph Smith's financial failure as a sign that he was a fallen prophet. So this was a big deal for the church, something Joseph should not have got involved in, should have asked God whether or not he should have done it, I guess. Okay, let's go to J. Reuben Clark's diary. He was in the First Presidency at the time, June 27, 1947 entry in his diary. President Clark suggested that there was more scandal about the society, that's the Kirtland Safety Society, there was more scandal about this than anything in the church. Well, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, a lot of people fell away. We're going to go over not all the regular people. We'll go over all of the general authorities and apostles that fell away. All right, so when something like this fails, the church and Joseph Smith need a scapegoat. And this has been a reoccurring theme in a lot of my videos, so this is nothing new to me. This is from the Apostle George A. Smith, pictured above, Journal of Discourses in 1864. He blames it on the cursed apostates. That's why the bank failed. It was the cursed apostates, their stealing and robberies. Apparently some of them stole money from the bank. That's his theory. And their infernal villainies that prevented that bank, the Kirtland Bank, from being conducted as the prophet designed. The apostates' fault. If they had followed the counsel of Joseph, there is no doubt but that it, the bank, would have been the leading bank in Ohio and probably of the nation. Not very likely. It was never going to become the leading bank of Ohio or the leading bank in the nation. But whatever, George A. Smith. All right, some interesting information from Orson F. Whitney. He would go on to become an apostle, and he was a historian for the church. This is his History of Utah, 1892. He's pictured above. He also finds a scapegoat. It's the counterfeiters and the bank's own officials, but of course not the leaders of the church, not those officials. So Orson says the career of the Kirtland Bank was very brief. That's true. It was like a couple months. It was already failing after a month, and it only lasted a couple months. Unable to collect its loans, victimized by counterfeiters, and robbed by some of its own officials, subordinates having charge of the funds, it soon collapsed. Okay, let's go to a statement by the Prophet Brigham Young, Journal of Discourses, 1853. Men of science and talent in this church believed, or they said that they believed, honestly, truly, and with all their hearts, that Joseph Smith did not understand anything about temporal matters. Well, he certainly didn't understand banking. And he and the other leaders of the church, Sidney Rigdon and Hiram Smith and whoever else, should have listened to the men of science and talent in the church. Okay, Prophet Brigham Young continues here in 1853. The first elders of this church decided that Joseph did not understand temporal matters. The first bishops of this church said that they believed with all their hearts that they understood temporal matters far better than the prophet Joseph. Brigham was probably going to say, no, Joseph Smith understood temporal matters just fine. But really, they really should have listened to these other people. Okay, a letter from William Law to James Mulholland, 1839. He would go on to become a member of the First Presidency and expose Joseph Smith's polygamy. So here he says, I have no doubt, but there has been transgression in the church, or the Lord would not scourge them. And as to Joseph building a bank at Kirtland, the Lord was angry with the saints and suffered them to have the bank as a snare, that he might punish them for their love of riches and speculation, etc. So it's just interesting. This is probably not true, but William Law pictured above. Okay, a statement here in the Messenger and Advocate, anniversary of the Church of the Latter-day Saints in April of 1837. So right here during this time frame, contemporary. Joseph Smith concluded by uttering a prophecy. I guess he was given a speech, saying that this place, Kirtland, must be built up and would be built up. Well, for a little while, right? It only lasted, what, like 6-7 years? Okay, let's go to the Doctrine and Covenants and get some more prophecies about Kirtland, Ohio. D&C 3818 here, Revelation to the Prophet Joseph Smith, January 2nd, 1831. This, I guess, is before they go to Kirtland. And the Lord says, and I hold forth and deign to give unto you greater riches, even a land of promise, a land flowing with milk and honey, talking about Kirtland, Ohio, upon which there shall be no curse when the Lord cometh. So was the Lord going to come while they're in Kirtland? Kind of makes it sound. Great riches, land of promise, flowing with milk and honey. Well, for a little while, right? I think most of the time they were there, they were quite poor. All right, D&C 38, 19, and 20, same revelation here. Jesus, or the Lord, I guess, speaking to the prophet Joseph Smith. And I will give it unto you for the land of your inheritance, if you seek it with all your hearts. Well, so there's the little exception, the little clause right there. If you don't seek it with all your hearts, maybe you can't have it as a land of inheritance. And I will give it unto you for the inheritance of your children forever, while the earth shall stand, and ye shall possess it again in eternity, no more to pass away. So did they have it forever? No. As long as the earth shall stand, no. And then they're going to have it in eternity. I certainly doubt that. But they always put a little clause in there, or Joseph often does, that you have to seek it with all your hearts. See, so the saints didn't seek it with all their hearts, so that's why they had to leave, probably, right? Okay, same Revelation, D&C 38:32. Wherefore, for this cause I gave unto you the commandment that ye should go to the Ohio, see picture above, and there I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high. All right, D&C 38:42, same Revelation in 1831. And go ye out from among the wicked and save yourselves. Kirtland, Ohio is going to allow them to save themselves and leave the wicked. All right, some more information about what Kirtland, Ohio was supposed to be, what the prophecies were. This is from Benjamin Winchester, pictured above. Primitive Mormonism article in Charles L. Woodward, First Half Century of Mormonism in the New York Public Library. Winchester says Joseph Smith in the 1830s received a revelation, which we've already gone over some of it in the D&C. He received a revelation especially concerning Kirtland, Ohio. It was to be the great center of the world. Kings and queens were to come there from foreign lands to pay homage. Well, did it become the great center of the world? Hardly. Did kings and queens come to visit from foreign lands? Hardly. Doesn't look like they'd want to come out and see Benjamin Winchester here. Looks like a humble farmer. Okay, some Richards family correspondence in 1836. Talking about a Joseph Young. He's pictured above. He is the brother of Brigham Young. Joseph Young predicted that the city of Kirtland would prosper and that no other city in the United States will for some years increase like Kirtland. Well, didn't really happen. All right, let's go to Wilford Woodruff's journal, April 6, 1837. Joseph presented us in some degree the plot of the city of Kirtland, which is the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, as it was given him by vision. So Joseph receiving these visions about Kirtland, what it would be. All right, Wilford Woodruff continues here in 1837 in his journal, talking about the vision of Joseph Smith. Steamboats will come puffing into the city. Did that happen? Probably not. Maybe some small ones, I don't know. Our goods will be conveyed upon railroads from Kirtland to many places and probably to Zion. Did that happen? No, probably not. Houses of worship would be reared unto the Most High. Maybe a few. All right, Wilford Woodruff continues. He would go on to become the prophet. He was a stalwart. I don't think he ever fell away. Always willing to follow the prophet, and then became a prophet. Talking about Joseph's vision, again, beautiful streets was to be made for the saints to walk in. I don't think they were that beautiful. Kings of the earth would come to behold the glory thereof. No, that did not happen. All right, so how long were the saints in Kirtland, Ohio? It tells us in Wikipedia in the Life of Joseph Smith from 1831 to 1837 article. The prophet Joseph Smith was in Kirtland, Ohio from January 1831 to January 1838, which is 7 years. Not a lot of time to accomplish all the things that were spoken of in the vision and revelation. All right, let's go to some BYU professors who put out a book, BYU Press, I think. Marvin S. Hill, C. Keith Rooker, and Larry T. Wimmer. The Kirtland Economy Revisited. And they make a claim here that the Kirtland economy collapsed because of this stupid bank. And then that's one of the big reasons they had to leave, right? So Hill, Rooker, and Wimmer claim that the collapse of the Kirtland economy rested squarely on operating a bank without a charter, since without legal status, all businesses that had been dealing with the saints hesitated to continue. So this collapsed the economy. All right, so another indication about how big of a deal this Kirtland bank crisis was how often it was showing up in newspapers across the country. This comes from Jeremy John Chatelain, a PhD dissertation, University of Utah, 2018, called The Imprint of the Press, etc., etc. And he says, the matter of the Mormon Bank was found in an unprecedented 86 articles in 12 states. 86 articles in 12 states, some of which I've read. There was only 26 states in the Union at the time. This was in 22 cities and in 29 newspapers from December 1836 to December of 1837. So this was a big deal, and a lot of people were following it, I guess. All right, so another theory about why Joseph wanted to start this bank that I've read from other historians like Von Brody, etc., and we'll get to her, is that they wanted to print their own money to be able to pay some of their debts, or a lot of their debts. So this is from the Mormon historian Leonard Arrington in his book Great Basin Kingdom, 1958. Arrington says, it has been estimated that by 1836, as much as $150,000 may have been owed by the Mormons of Kirtland, Ohio, to merchants, banks, and capitalists in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, and Buffalo. So the church was in a lot of debt. $150,000 in 1836 would be about $5 million in 2023. So nothing to scoff at here. Okay, so John Corrill puts this debt at around $80,000 or $90,000. He put out A Brief History of the Church in 1839, so only a couple years after this stuff was happening. I've used this source for my Danite videos and maybe some other ones. It can be found in the Joseph Smith Papers. You can read the whole thing. John Corrill said that Mormons ran in debt in New York and elsewhere some $30,000 for goods, and shortly after some $50,000 or $60,000 more, as I was informed. All right, Donna Hill talks about this in her book, Joseph Smith, the First Mormon, 1977. I think she was a Mormon lady, professor at Hunter College, not nearly as scathing in her book as like Von Brody, but she covers the Kirtland Bank crisis pretty well in here. She says the First Presidency came to the conclusion that if they had their own bank, it would enable the saints to pay their debts, give them and their neighbors a needed medium of exchange, and improve the economy in Kirtland by keeping capital in the area and providing an incentive to business. All right, Joseph Young, letter to Lewis Harvey in 1880. I'm not sure if this is the brother of Brigham Young. But he says the prophet had conceived a plan of instituting a bank with a view of relieving their financial embarrassments. So in other words, to pay debts. All right, an article in the Ohio Observer that I read called About Matters in Kirtland, March 2nd, 1837. It says, last fall, in pursuance of a revelation of Joseph, a bank was projected to pay off their mountains of debt and make all the Mormons rich, who could not do it by land speculation. Well, they were only rich for about a month after they printed the money. This is the first time we see that it was a revelation of Joseph, and we're going to go to more primary accounts stating that indeed this idea of the bank was a revelation of Joseph. Apologists don't want you to know that, and if you watch kind of the more Mormon apologist type of videos on YouTube and other places, they really want you to believe that it was not a revelation, because this makes Joseph look really bad. And pictured above, there's Joseph. All right, so in this article, it kind of explains how the bank worked. At a special meeting for taking up the stock, so people bought stock in this bank, each subscriber paid little or nothing. That's true, and we'll show kind of what they did pay. Everybody kind of paid whatever they wanted. But they pledged his property for security. So their land they used for security to get the printed money. For example, a man who owned a building lot near the temple would sign $5,000 and pledge his lot for security. The problem with this, the land being the security, is it's not a liquid asset. It's not like gold and silver. All right, so it's kind of hard to understand what this bank was, how it was set up, the history of it. I'm going to use two basic sources here to kind of tell the short story of what this bank was. One is going to be from Fawn Brody's book, No Man Knows My History, 1945. The other one is going to be from the book The Saints, which relies fairly heavily on the Joseph Smith papers, which is pretty decent. But I would go with the Brody information over the Saints information. But anyway, Brody says here, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank Company, organized in November 1836, with a capital stock of not less than $4 million, which was really a lot at the time, was expected to solve the problem of the Saints' debts, by the beguiling simple expedient of stamping out new notes. Okay, just printing money. This is what Fawn Brody says, and this is how I think it happened. In the Saints book, they try to make it sound like people were getting loans from the bank, and I don't think that's how it worked. But we'll get to the Saints books after all of these slides from Brody. The beguiling simple expedient of just printing out money. Whenever possible, these notes were to be exchanged for hard money, silver and gold, right? I think the leaders of the church knew that this cash wasn't worth anything, and definitely had the possibility of becoming worthless, so they wanted to exchange it with silver and gold whenever they could, or maybe property or other goods and services that were more real. Okay, Brody continues. At any time other than the mid-1830s, such a plan would have been mad. The frontier had always favored the expansion of currency and any law designed to relieve the debtor class. Okay, Brody continues. Now, because of the frenetic land speculation, there was an enormous demand for money and a need for new banking facilities. All that was required to start a bank in the West was an unlimited amount of nerve and the necessary capital to pay the engraver and printer for making the notes, which the Mormons had enough money to do that. All right, Brody continues here. The short story of the Kirtland Bank. Then we'll get on to other matters. One bank in Ohio was chartered as an Orphans Institute. You can see their printed notes above. Orphans Institute Bank. Another was founded on the charter of a moribund library association. Its total assets a remnant of dog-eared books. So these were very shaky, not very solid banks. All right, the number of authorized banks operating in the state of Ohio had jumped from 11 in 1830 to 33 in 1836. So people are going crazy with this, I believe, after the National Bank was dissolved by Jackson. All right, besides these, there were 9 unauthorized institutions also issuing money. Kirtland Bank was also unauthorized, no charter. Banknote circulation in 1836 was 70% greater than in 1835. Here's one of the banks, Bank of Granville, Alexandrian, $3 note. Okay, Fawn Brody continues. There were at least 300 different kinds of authorized notes, to say nothing of the illegal bills and counterfeits, variously styled Yellow Dog, Smooth Monkey, Blue Pup, and Sick Indian. Brody would probably say that the Mormons' notes were illegal bills. And then she gives a bunch of sources here for all this information here that you can look at. Okay, to the chaos of Ohio's banking system was now added Joseph's Safety Society. Subscriptions to the capital stock ranged from 1,000 to 500,000, most of the subscribers paying in Kirtland boomtown lots at 5 and 6 times normal value. So these subscribers paying in lots, I guess. Pictured above here is a map, one of the early maps of Kirtland. All right, Brody continues. According to the Painesville Telegraph, Joseph Smith estimated his own land in Kirtland at $300,000, it's a lot of money, and stated that the whole capital stock of the bank was comprised in land lying within 2 square miles. Okay, on January 1st, 1837, the same day that the printed banknotes arrived in Kirtland, there came the disconcerting news that the Ohio legislature had refused to incorporate the bank. Okay, its operation thus became illegal in the same week that the publicity campaign was launched. All right, we'll go on a little bit of a tangent here from Brody's book about the Kirtland Bank being illegal. This is a professor of law and history at the University of Pennsylvania, Sarah B. Gordon. She did a chapter in a book called The Oxford Handbook of Mormonism in 2015. This chapter is called Mormons and the Law. And according to her opinion, charges of fraud followed the prophet to Ohio, where in early 1837, Joseph Smith and other Mormon leaders established a rogue bank after their request to create a legal one had been denied by the state legislature. So this is a rogue bank, not a legal bank. And Sarah B. Gordon pictured above. All right, Professor Gordon continues. The Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Bank Company was ill-considered and ill-timed, and its notes were by definition fraudulent. The notes of the Kirtland Bank were fraudulent, and we'll get to why they called it the anti-bank further on in Brody's story. All right, Professor Gordon continues. When the prophet left Ohio for Missouri in 1838, he was bankrupt, and his opponents had come to believe that he regarded himself as above the law. All right, Fawn Brody continues in the story of this Kirtland Bank. Only one new bank was allowed incorporation in this legislative session, the hard money wing of the Democratic Party, known as the No Bank Party, or the Loco Focos, had gained control and was determined to stop the increase of wildcat banks. Here's one of the banks from around the area, I guess, the Bank of Manchester. Looks like a $3 note. All right, Brody continues. Joseph Smith, however, was too resourceful to be stopped by a formality. On January 2nd, the Kirtland Safety Society Bank became the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Bank Company. All right, the already engraved banknotes were stamped with the prefix anti before and the suffix ing after the word bank. So it became the anti-banking company. Since they were already printed or engraved, they did this apparently with a stamp. Okay, after they had these printed and stamped, now began the most exuberantly prosperous fortnight in Kirtland's history. Everybody's pockets bulged with bills. Okay, local debts were paid off at once, and Joseph sent couriers east to pay the huge obligations of the Kirtland mercantile firms. All right, Brody continues to tell the story. This is very abbreviated, of course, from what's in the book. None of the men who remained faithful to Joseph ever publicly discussed the true financial situation of the Kirtland Bank. They didn't want to talk about it publicly, which is a very common Mormon theme. Okay, so Brody continues. According to Warren Parrish, who's Warren Parrish? Well, he was a 70 bank cashier after Joseph was, and then he became a dissenter. So, according to Warren Parrish, Joseph Smith said that we had but $10,000 of our bills in circulation when he, as cashier of that institution, knew that there was at least $150,000 of bills in circulation. So Warren Parrish is saying that Joseph Smith lied, that Joseph said there's only $10,000 of our bills out there when it was at least $150,000 out there. Okay, Cleveland, Ohio merchants began to refuse the Kirtland banknotes. They refused them, though not before about $36,000 worth had been passed in the city. So at least they got to use $36,000 worth of them. Okay, merchants in Buffalo and New York scorned the notes from the beginning, and no bank anywhere would touch them. Okay, soon the bills were streaming back into Kirtland. Joseph redeemed a good number before he realized that the run on the bank was about to ruin him. Okay, Brody continues. On January 27th, 1837, less than a month after the bank's opening, the Painesville Telegraph reported that Joseph had shut up shop, saying that he would not redeem another dollar except with land. So this bank really only lasted about a month, even less than a month. There was a run on the bank. People would bring the notes and try to get the gold or the silver for them right. The Mormons didn't really have a lot of gold and silver. That's called specie. We'll go over that in more detail later. So they were not redeeming the notes in specie, but they said they would redeem them with land, which is probably most people didn't want, which is like a non-liquid asset. So. Okay, everybody possessing Kirtland bank bills now tried desperately to get rid of them. By February 1st, this is 3 days after the last slide, by February 1st, they were selling for 12.5 cents on the dollar. So $1 was only worth 12.5 cents. So this bank just tanked. All right, Brody continues. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon resigned, and F.G. Williams and Warren Parrish took over the offices of president and cashier in a final effort to salvage something from the wreckage. All right, in the month of May was brought disaster to the whole country. Within a single month, 800 banks containing $120 million in deposits suspended operations. Okay, the Kirtland Bank, which had collapsed 4 months before the panic began, actually continued issuing notes until June, even though they're worth, 12 cents on the dollar. Okay, then on June 29, Sidney Rigdon was brought to court for making spurious money, and the practice was finally stopped. Here is a Boston Bank $5 note that's been rated by this company called PMG, Paper Money Guarantee, and they labeled this note as spurious. So they weren't the only ones doing this kind of stuff. Okay, Brody continues here. It was not until August, however, that Joseph formally renounced the bank in the Messenger and Advocate. This was long after the fact that it failed, and warned his people against accepting the banknotes. Okay, some of the saints lost very real, though modest, fortunes, but eventually they washed the slate clean of grievances and refused to sully their journals with complaints. Pictured above Fawn Brody. All right, let's tell the story of the Kirtland Safety Society banking institution / company from the point of view of the church. We're going to use Saints, the Standard of Truth, Volume 1, 2018. There's 2 more volumes of this for later years. I like the Saints books because they simplify the story of the bank, make it pretty easy to understand. A lot of what's in there is based on the Joseph Smith papers. Same thing with No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. She simplifies things, makes it easier to understand. If you read things like BYU Studies, put out by the church, they have a number of articles about this banking crisis. It gets too complex. They start talking about complex financial matters and laws and stuff. So that's why I chose these. I don't agree with everything that's here in the Saints, but they simplify the story. So here we go. Church leaders announced their plans to start the Kirtland Safety Society, a village bank designed to boost Kirtland's struggling economy and raise money for the church. All right, the Saints Volume 1 continues here. Like other small banks in the United States, it would provide loans to borrowers so they could purchase property and goods, helping the local economy grow. As borrowers paid these loans back with interest, the bank would turn a profit. Now, I'm not even sure if any of this is true because I didn't hear much about this at all in other sources. So my guess is that they really weren't providing loans to borrowers so that they could buy houses and etc. But that's what it says in the Saints. All right, same source here. Loans would be issued in the form of bank notes backed by the Safety Society's limited reserve of silver and gold coins. To build up this reserve of hard money, the bank would sell shares of stock to investors who committed to make payments on their shares over time. Okay, as more saints took out loans, often using their land as collateral, the notes began circulating around Kirtland and elsewhere. All right, Saints continues. The saints in Kirtland continued to borrow large sums of money to purchase property and goods. Employers sometimes paid workers in banknotes, which could be used as currency or redeemed for hard money at the Kirtland Safety Society office, which there wasn't a whole lot of hard money in there. All right, without this approval or without a charter, the Safety Society could not call itself a bank, but it could still take deposits and issue loans. Okay, the bank's success relied on stockholders making payments on their shares so the institution could maintain its reserves. But these were really small payments, and we'll go over some of these payments in the ledger. Few stockholders had enough hard money to do that. I think a lot of them just made one installment payment, and that was kind of it. Okay, let's go to some statements by the prophet Joseph Smith, History of the Church, Volume 2. On the 2nd of November, 1836, the brethren at Kirtland drew up certain articles of agreement preparatory to the organization of a banking institution to be called the Kirtland Safety Society. Assistant President Oliver Cowdery was delegated to Philadelphia to procure plates for the institution, maybe something like pictured above. And Elder Orson Hyde to repair to Columbus with a petition to the legislature of Ohio for an act of incorporation, which was presented at an early period of their session. Okay, the prophet Joseph Smith continues in the same source. Oliver Cowdery succeeded at a great expense in procuring the plates, these printing plates, which were to be used to print the bank money. But because we were Mormons, the legislature raised some frivolous excuse on which they refused to grant us those banking privileges that they so freely granted to others. It wasn't because they were Mormons, it's because they were hardly giving out any charters at this time. Oliver Cowdery pictured above. All right, some more information from John Corrill in A Brief History of the Church, 1839, Joseph Smith Papers. They also got up a bank for which they could get no charter. So they issued their paper without a charter. That's what made it illegal. And of course, they could not collect their pay on notes received for loans. And after struggling with it a while, they broke down. Okay, John Corrill continues. During their mercantile and banking operations, They not only indulged in pride, but also suffered jealousies to arise among them. And several persons dissented from the church and accused the leaders of the church with bad management, selfishness, seeking for riches, honor, and dominion, tyrannizing over the people, and striving constantly after power and property. Yeah, sounds about right. Okay, a statement here from John Whitmer, one of the 8 witnesses to the golden plates, also the historian for the church at this time, 1836, 1837. His history from 1831 to 1847 can be found in the Joseph Smith papers, and he's pictured above. So he says, in the fall of 1836, the prophet Joseph Smith Jr., Sidney Rigdon, who was in the First Presidency, and others of the leaders of the church at Kirtland, Ohio, established a bank for the purpose of speculation, and the whole church partook of the same spirit. They were lifted up in pride and lusted after the forbidden things of God, such as covetousness. All right, you always think of the Apostle Parley P. Pratt as being a stalwart, but he was pretty pissed off at what was going on at the time in the church, 1836, 1837. This is a letter from Parley, May 23rd, 1837, in the Joseph Smith papers. He says, I, Parley, have at length become fully convinced that the whole scene of speculation in which we have been engaged is of the devil. All the speculation. Probably put in the Kirtland Bank in that speculation as well. I allude to the covetous, extortionary, speculating spirit which has reigned in this place of Kirtland for the last season, which has given rise to lying, deceiving, and taking the advantage of one's neighbor, and in short, to every evil work. Parley was actually pissed off at Joseph Smith at this time because Joseph Smith was making him pay back some loan, and I think they took Parley's house. All right, the Apostle Parley P. Pratt continues. This is what this source looks like here in the Joseph Smith papers. And being as fully convinced that you, Joseph, and President Sidney Rigdon, both by precept and example, have been the principal means in leading this people astray in these particulars. That's pretty strong language, right? The Apostle Parley P. Pratt telling Joseph Smith that he's leading the saints astray by false prophesying and preaching from your mouths, yea, having done many things wrong. Joseph is accused of false prophesying and preaching. Maybe the revelation that the bank would succeed, right? Maybe the revelation that the economy in Kirtland, Ohio would be wonderful when it wasn't. Okay, the Apostle Parley P. Pratt continues in the same letter, 1837. And now, dear brother Joseph and Sidney, if you are still determined to pursue this wicked course until yourself and the church shall sink down to hell, see picture above, but if not, I shall be under the painful necessity of preferring charges against you for extortion, covetousness, and taking advantage of your brother by an undue religious influence. Wow, that's cult language, right? Undue influence. Parley pissed off here, telling Joseph he's pursuing a wicked course, and if he continues on this, the church will sink down to hell. Okay, another source here from Newell K. Whitney collection. Charges against Joseph Smith Jr., special collections at BYU, talking about the apostles Orson Pratt and Lyman Johnson. See pictures above. On May 29, 1837, apostles Orson Pratt and Lyman Johnson brought charges against Joseph Smith before a bishop's court, condemning him for lying and misrepresentation. This word lying is coming up a lot. Bishop's court for lying and misrepresentation, also for extortion and for speaking disrespectfully against his brethren behind their backs. All right, a statement here from Warren Parrish. We've already talked about him a little. He was a 70, a dissenter, and the bank cashier after Joseph wanted nothing to do with the bank anymore. This is a letter to the editor, February 5th, 1838, so early on, in the Painesville Republican. So Warren Parrish says, for the last year, or for the, for the year past, Rigdon and Smith's lives have been one continued scene of lying, deception, and fraud, and that too in the name of God. There's that word lying again. But this I can account for in my own mind, having a knowledge of their private characters and sentiments. Pictured above, Sidney Rigdon. All right, Warren Parrish continues here. This then is the conclusion of the whole matter. Rigdon and Smith lie by revelation. They swindle by revelation, cheat and defraud by revelation, run away by revelation. And if they do not mend their ways, I fear that they will at last be damned by revelation. So yeah, we're going to get to the sources where Joseph Smith said that this whole idea of the bank was given to him by revelation, given to him in a vision. But yeah, Warren Parrish saying, hey, they lie, they swindle, they cheat, they defraud, they run away. Okay, let's go to a statement by William E. McClellan in a newspaper, I think, Ensign of Liberty, Kirtland, Ohio, March 1847. So about 10 years after the fact. William was an apostle around this time, 1837. So he was in a position to know things. He's pictured above. He says, soon therefore, it is determined. God, I can't speak. It is determined that a Kirtland bank must be established to hold their treasures and to aid them to get more. So eager were they and so sanguine of success that they did not even wait to get a charter from the state, but seemed to think that everything must bow at their nod, thus violating the laws of the land in which they live, which in the end brought upon them swift destruction, to the point where they had to leave Kirtland. Pretty much the Kirtland economy went belly up. Joseph Smith went bankrupt. Not a good situation. All right, William E. McClellan in a letter to John L. Trauber, December 14, 1878, a late account. They set up a Kirtland bank without a charter from the state. It ran for a while, long enough to get moneyed men of the church to take stock in it. Well, quite a few of them didn't have that much money, just a little extra. But this bank broke down to the financial ruin of many confidential men. The state authorities fined Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon $1,000 each. That's true, and we'll get to that. And they ran away from Kirtland in the night, hidden away in a wagon. Okay, another statement from William E. McClellan. Letter to President Joseph Smith, July 1872, RLDS Archives. I think this is a letter to the president of the RLDS Church. Remember William E. McClellan, an apostle, around this time, 1837. They, Joseph Smith Jr., et al., and others, formed a kind of an association and kept it up until they went into that swindling Kirtland banking concern about which so many lies were prophesied. Again, he says there was a lot of lies about this. Lies that were prophesied. So again, Joseph Smith giving prophecies, Joseph Smith giving revelations about this bank. Okay, let's go to the Constitution of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. November 2nd, 1836. This is in the Joseph Smith papers. We have the Constitution in there. 32 stockholders were then elected as bank directors, and they elected 2 primary officers for the society. Who were these primary officers? Sidney Rigdon as president and Joseph Smith as cashier. What do these offices mean? We're going to explain that. Okay, the historian Richard S. Van Wagner explains to us what a bank cashier was at the time. It's not like it is nowadays as a cashier. Sidney Rigdon, A Portrait of Religious Excess book in 1994. Cashiers at that time were commonly the chief operating officers of the bank. They were responsible for daily operations, including transactions, bookkeeping, accounts, records, and personnel, answering to the president. I guess Joseph didn't want to be the president. He gave that to Sidney, or maybe Sidney wanted to do it. But Joseph Smith was basically the chief operating officer. Okay, Van Wagner continues. Despite their official designations, Rigdon and Smith were co-equals in the Kirtland Safety Society. So, again, it shows how important Rigdon was in the early days of the church. You can watch my Solomon and Spaulding and Sidney Rigdon video about how maybe they're the ones that came up with the Book of Mormon. That video is now getting pretty popular. Okay, some more information in the Joseph Smith Papers. Documents, Volume 5 volume, but you can also look at this online. Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and the Society's stockholders reorganized their institution on January 2nd, 1837. They restructured the society as an unincorporated bank, renaming it the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company, and drafted new articles of agreement to replace the original constitution. So, yeah, now they're going to be calling it an anti-banking company because they could not get the charter. All right, same source here. This change in structure led to new titles for the society's officers. Rigdon became the secretary and Joseph Smith the treasurer. This is something a lot of historians either don't know about or they leave out, that their titles did change. Rigdon became the secretary, not the president. Joseph Smith became the treasurer, not the cashier. They're kind of setting it up more like a company instead of a bank, but their idea is still to basically run it as a bank. Okay, so after this reorganization, the society conducted banking services in an unofficial capacity, while Orson Hyde continued pursuing a bank charter. Orson Hyde pictured above. Hyde never able to get a charter. Okay, the historian Dan Vogel talks about this in his new book, Charisma Under Pressure, 2023. I've read part of this, especially about this issue and about the Danites. Looks to be a very good book, despite what Brian Hale says. The new articles avoided the use of banking terminology, replacing, for instance, bank with company, stockholders with managers or members, and directors with managers. Instead of president and cashier, Rigdon became the secretary and Joseph Smith became the treasurer. All right, so they came up with the Articles of Agreement for this bank instead of the Constitution. Article 14 says, all notes given by the said society shall be signed by the treasurer, Joseph, and the secretary, Rigdon, thereof. So they're still signing them, or Phelps is signing for them, or Phelps is signing for Joseph. And we, the individual members of the said firm, hereby hold ourselves bound for the redemption of all such notes. Okay, an interesting article in the Cleveland Daily Gazette, January 20, 1837, Mormon currency. Also see a new revelation, Mormon money, Cleveland Daily Gazette, January 12, 1837. Interesting they call this a new revelation, right? Editors for the Cleveland Gazette expressed surprise at the readiness with which these anti-banking bank bills are thrown into circulation without any evidence or knowledge of the solvency of the issues, and considered it a most reprehensible fraud on the public, since as far as we can learn there is no property bound for the redemption, no coin on hand to redeem them with, and no responsible individuals whose honor or whose honesty is pledged for their payment. So we're going to get more to this. They didn't have a lot of a coin, a gold or silver coin on hand to back up the currency. supposedly mostly backed up by land, but like I said before, land is not liquid. Okay, so let's talk about the Kirtland Safety Society Bank Stock Ledger. This shows those who invested. This is from Southern Illinois University professor of history Stanley B. Kimball. Did an article in BYU Studies in 1971. I think this is the first time anybody had really found this ledger and had talked about it and what it was. It was originally the Chicago Historical Society that owned it, that owned this original stock ledger and the index to the ledger of the Kirtland Safety Society. This ledger is now in the Joseph Smith papers. You can go and look at it. It's a little hard to understand because the columns are kind of messed up, but it's now in the Joseph Smith papers. All right, Professor of History Stanley B. Kimball, talking more about this ledger. This stock ledger has been secreted since the bank failed in 1837 and was found by Arthur B. Deming while securing evidence as to the true origin and early history of Mormonism. So I'm not sure when Deming found it, maybe around 1888 when the Naked Truths About Mormonism came out. This is a cool source that I've used before. You can see this is kind of what it looked like. Centennial Memorial Edition, Naked Truths About Mormonism in memory of Arthur B. Deming. All right, so Stanley B. Kimball kind of gives a summary of what he found in this ledger. Again, BYU Studies 1971. A lot of the shares owned by the Smith family. I think that the Smith family thought of this as a potential way to get rich. If this bank succeeded, they could basically be rich. They could just print their own money. And whatever profits that the bank made, they made. I'm not sure if it even ran that way as far as giving out loans and making profits. Personally, I think it was probably just to print money. You just print money and you use it, and if people believe in that money and accept that money, then it's good money. So anyway, Kimball talks about what was on this ledger. He says the ledger is 287 pages long and shows the entries for 200 persons, including the prophet Joseph Smith, his wife Emma Smith, his father Joseph Smith Sr., his mother Lucy Smith, who owned 500 shares, and we'll go over the shares of the others in a bit, his brother Hiram Smith, his sister Jerusha Smith, who had 1,200 shares. I think the maximum you could have was 3,000. His brother Samuel H. Smith had 2,000 shares. His first cousin George A. Smith had 5 shares. So a lot of Joseph Smith's family invested in this bank. Also, the Apostle Brigham Young, Lorenzo Young had 20 shares, Erastus Snow, Lorenzo Snow, Apostle Heber C. Kimball, one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, David Whitmer. David Whitmer had 1,000 shares. In the First Presidency, Sidney Rigdon, Wilford Woodruff had shares, Apostle Parley P. Pratt, Truman O. Angel, Reynolds Cahoon, Vincent Knight, Assistant President of the Church Oliver Cowdery had 2,000 shares, which is a lot. Apostle Luke Johnson, 2,000 shares, and Elijah Abel, a Negro convert, 20 shares. So that's interesting that a black person had 20 shares. All right, going to the historical introduction of the Constitution of the Bank in the Joseph Smith Papers, November 2nd, 1836. The first subscription recorded in the Society Stock Ledger, dated October 18, 1836, was for 2,000 shares of stock for Sidney Rigdon, who paid $630 on his subscription by October 22. So Rigdon has 2,000 shares. Again, I believe the maximum is 3,000 shares, so he's pretty heavily invested in this. He only pays $630 for those shares. Everybody pays different amounts. I think it's $50 a share was what it was supposed to be, but everybody just kind of paid whatever they wanted. Rigdon pictured above. Okay, same source here. Historical introduction to the constitution of the bank. Rigdon continued to pay the bank for his stock, and sometime later he subscribed for an additional 1,000 shares, thus reaching the maximum number of 3,000 shares a single stockholder could hold. So Rigdon really hoping that this bank would succeed and that he would get rich, probably. All right, Stanley B. Kimball continues here. This source, the ledger, has been little used, if at all, and throws much light on this complicated phase of Mormon history. One reason for the fact that this source is relatively unknown is that few people would suppose that such an item to be in Chicago Historical Society, right? And I think this is the picture of that. Okay, Stanley B. Kimball continues here. You can see what this article looks like. Sources on the history of the Mormons in Ohio. BYU Studies, 1971. The following cursory analysis of this ledger reveals that the 200 individuals subscribed for various numbers of shares, from 3,000 to 5. So you could have up to a maximum of 3,000. The lowest amount of shares somebody had was 5 shares, with the face value of from $150,000 to $50. So that's interesting. So people like Joseph Smith that had 3,000 shares, maybe that had a face value of $150,000 from the notes that they would get from their investment. So the notes could have a face value of from $150,000 to only $50, and they paid for them in cash amounts varying from $4,887 paid in by Joseph Smith, so he put in a lot more, but he had access to a lot more resources, right, from different aspects of the church. So Joseph put in about $5,000, all the way down to 52 cents by Alex Valliere. Again, Joseph had 3,000 shares, the maximum. Okay, Stanley B. Kimball continues here. You can also see the Joseph Smith papers about this in Documents Volume 5 or online. The grand totals eloquently reveal the inherent weakness of the project. 200 persons subscribed to 79,420 shares, worth at face value approximately $3.8 million. If you had 3,000 shares, you could have up to $150,000 in just printed money. But 79,000 shares worth about $3.8 million, which was way more than other banks at the time. They had a $50 par value per share. So it was supposed to be a $50 per share purchase, but I don't think they followed that very closely. A $50 par value per share, which was paid for with only $20,725 in specie. So you basically have $20,700 in hard money. You turn that into $4 million. You see why the Smith family thought they were going to get rich off this. What is specie? Specie is coin, copper, silver, or gold, coined and used as a circulating medium of commerce. So the specie backing it up is gold, copper, silver coins. They only had 20,000 of that, so not a lot if a lot of people are going to come and want to redeem their bills. All right, let's go to a source from the researcher Kathleen K. Melanakos. Put out an interesting book called Secret Combinations, Evidence of Early Mormon Counterfeiting in 2016. She references a couple other books here, which you can see by Huntington and Mim. So Melanakos says the Kirtland notes were printed with the promise on them that the bearer is entitled to gold or silver in the designated amount from its issuing bank. Any bank that did not have anywhere near enough specie, gold or silver specie, on hand to redeem its outstanding notes was considered wildcat. So that's her definition of wildcat. The church, of course, has their own definition. But her definition is if you don't have much specie, only 20,000 bucks, and you're issuing $4 million in notes, she calls that wildcat. All right, back to Richard S. Van Wagner in the Sidney Rigdon book. Picture of Van Wagner in his younger years. My family actually knew him. So Van Wagner says, lacking sufficient cash reserves to back up its currency, bank officials offered inflated real estate instead of coin for scrip exchanges when put to the test. So I'm not sure how much real estate was actually given out. Real estate was actually kind of a lot easier to get than gold and silver. Okay, another person that agrees with Melanakos is Tufts University history professor John L. Brooke, pictured above, put out a great book called The Refiner's Fire, The Making of Mormon Cosmology, 1644 to 1844. So he starts it out really early. Mormon history goes back to 1644, right? At least the cosmology of it. This book came out in 1994. It's a book that drives BYU apologists crazy. Brooks says the operation of the Kirtland Safety Society without a bank charter was a form of money-making, quote unquote, that lay somewhere on the spectrum between legitimate wildcat banking and counterfeiting. Somewhere between a wildcat bank and a counterfeit bank. John L. Brooks' opinion. Okay, back to Stanley B. Kimball, Southern Illinois University professor of history, 1971 article in BYU Studies. Heber C. Kimball, he says, for example, subscribed to $50,000 worth of shares. So you're getting $50,000 in notes, right? Which is 1,000 shares for only $15 in cash. It's supposed to be $50 a share, right? They didn't follow this. Maybe they were supposed to make future installment payments. The bank was only open for a month. So not a whole lot of payments were made, right? I mean, the bank started to crash in a month. But Kimball got $50,000 for only $15. See, they're basically just printing money. Other important Mormons paid in correspondingly small sums. Brigham Young paid in $7 for 2,000 shares. So I guess Brigham was above Kimball. $7 for 2,000 shares. It's supposed to be $50 a share. That's not what they paid. Lorenzo Snow, $7.97 for 30 shares. So I guess he's a lot less important than Young and Kimball. Wilford Woodruff paid in $5.25 for 20 shares, so not much. Erastus Snow paid in $5.25 for 10 shares. So some of this bracketed data I looked through the ledger to provide. Kimball didn't provide all of this, the bracketed data. I'm just kind of using his account here and then putting in the shares from the ledger. So, and pictured above, we got Heber C. Kimball, Lorenzo Snow, Wilford Woodruff. Yeah, Lorenzo Snow and Wilford Woodruff maybe not as important at this time, but definitely would become important in the church as they would both become prophets. Okay, Stanley B. Kimball continues here. A few others, however, were able to come up with larger amounts of money. Parley P. Pratt came up with $102, but he got 1,000 shares for that. It's supposed to be 50 a share, but he got 1,000 shares. Hiram Smith, $169 he put in and got 2,000 shares. Vincent Knight put in $262. He got 1,000 shares. Emma Smith put in $315, got 1,200 shares. Joseph Smith Sr. put in $323 and got 1,000 shares. And W.J. Peterson, $785 he put in and got 200 shares. He kind of got ripped off. A lot of these shares owned by the Smith family, as we've talked about. Pictured above, Hiram Smith, Emma Smith, and Joseph Smith Sr. Okay, Donna Hill talks about this, how the Smith family had a lot of the shares in her book, Joseph Smith, the First Mormon, 1977. She says, of the 69,000 shares subscribed in the ledger, A total of 48,000 were owned by only 30 individuals, of whom 8 were relatives of Joseph Smith, holding in toto about 1/6 of the stock. So the Smith family had control of about 1/6 of the stock for this bank. All right, Mark L. Staker talks about this in his book, Hearken, O Ye People. It's a pretty faith-promoting version, I think, of this story. I believe he's a researcher. He got a PhD somewhere. I don't believe he's a professor. This book came out in 2010. A lot of historians like using this book. I think it's a bit apologetical, but there's a few parts in here that I'm going to use. So he says, the Kirtland Safety Society had more than 200 men and women across the social spectrum as investors. However, because stockholders could vote by proxy, 57% of the burden and blessing of ownership rested on only 3 families. 57%, the Smiths, the Rigdons, and the Johnsons. So, yeah. All right, Staker continues, he's pictured above. The Joseph Sr. and Lucy Smith family represented the largest voting block of family membership at stockholder meetings. Yeah, they had the most shares, right? 1/6 probably, and had the most to lose if the institution failed. So yeah, that's kind of faith promoting there. He doesn't say they had the most to gain if the institution was a success. Okay, some more data from Staker. The Smith family controlled 12,800 shares, or 33% of all the recorded Kirtland Safety Society stock. So he puts the number a lot higher, not 1/6, not 17%, but 33% the Smith family controlled. Okay, Mark L. Staker continues, and Hearken, O Ye People. Put out by Coford Books. Kind of have a love-hate relationship with them. The Johnson family had just over 13% of all known Kirtland Safety Society stock. Johnson family had 13%. Their $600 cash invested in the institution represented 8,200 shares of stock for only $600. 8,200 shares of stock at $50 a share is $410,000. They are printing money here. I don't think the church wants to talk about this. They're printing money out of nothing. The Johnson family had 3 apostles, Luke, Lyman, and son-in-law John Boynton, all pictured above. I believe Luke and Lyman left the church. John might have left the church too. All right, Staker continues. Sidney Rigdon, Phoebe, and Sidney's mother, Nancy Rigdon, had the 3rd largest controlling interest in this bank, with a total of 4,400 shares for just under 11% of the stock. Rigdon family, so they had 4,400 shares. $50 a share would be $220,000. Didn't put in too much money to get that. So again, they're printing money out of nothing. All right, so Donna Hill talks about how all these investors are not paying $50 a share. The ledger indicates that although the face value of the shares was $50, more than 95% of the shareholders bought the shares at 26.25 cents per share. Not even close to $50 a share, right? That's why they had no specie. 26. What they actually paid is 26.25 cents. Not even $1 per share. Often on credit. What was their credit? Probably their land, I guess. All right, Donna Hill continues. That price, that very low price per share, could have been meant as the first payment on installment, since some of the accounts were so noted, but many shareholders never paid further amounts. They only made one installment. And I think if you look at the ledger, most of them only paid one installment. And like I said before, the bank was only open in a month, so you're not going to pay too many installments. I mean, it basically started to crash in a month. Okay, Donna Hill continues. She's pictured above. I think this is the first time I found her picture. So there she goes. That's what she looks like. Hunter College, I think, professor. I think she was a Mormon woman. I wouldn't be surprised if the church was kind of behind this book as kind of an answer, as kind of a softer answer to No Man Knows My History. But she says Joseph Smith and a few others paid a higher rate than 26 1/4 cents, and some paid even less, but nobody paid face value. This bank was basically a joke. This was not a professional bank. It's basically a wildcat bank. And people didn't pay what they were supposed to pay according to the Constitution or the Articles of Agreement. Okay, Donna Hill continues. When it was reported later that stock values dropped to 12.5 cents per share, that's what it was like for a dollar of notes, right? They had dropped it to the value or the worth of only 12.5 cents per share. This is when the bank is crashing. The actual loss was much less than face value indicated. Yeah, because people weren't paying $50 a share, so they actually lost a lot less money. Like what Brigham Young lost like $7. All right, Donna continues. Stock might not have actually been issued since no specimens have been found, at least not like these stock notes, kind of like pictured above, that kind of look like this, Erie and Ohio Railroad stock certificate, I guess. It is not known if bank notes were distributed for subscriptions, although it is possible that they were put in circulation that way. I think she's doing a little apologetics here. What would be the point if you're an investor in this? You're investing money, but you don't get any bank notes. I think the point was to get the bank notes for yourself and then spend them. You turn $7 into a lot of money. All right, the Joseph Smith papers talk about this as well. The combination of relatively low share prices, very low, so they didn't pay their 50, an unusual high capital stock, 4 million, and a very low initial installment payment for the stock, yes, some of which was never paid, meant that the society was low on funds from the outset. Yep, all true. Common stock certificate above, I guess. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. I don't think the church or Joseph Smith put out these common stock certificates. I think they just give them the banknotes. All right, back to Mark L. Staker. Hearken, O ye people. The Kirtland Enterprise sold stock at $50 a share, which could be paid for in modest installments. But he doesn't really talk about what they really did pay here. All right, so the local area, probably Kirtland and maybe some of the surrounding area, believed in these notes. And that's really what you have to have. You have to have belief that these notes are going to be good for this bank to work. But the people over on the East Coast didn't have so much faith in the Mormons or their bank. So Don Hill says, Joseph Jr. was never able to use the Kirtland Bank notes to pay his big creditors in New York, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, but she reports that he used them for local debts. Yeah, for a short while. All right, so for the short amount of time that they were flush with cash, John J. Hammond says something in his book, Crisis in Mormon Kirtland, a Temple and an Illegal Bank, 2013. The Mormons in Kirtland, encouraged by their leaders' revelatory assurances, went on a buying spree. All right, Donna Hill continues here. The unsophisticated thought that owning shares in the stock company had made their fortune, since an investment of only $52 for 200 shares would have a face value of $10,000. That's what I'm talking about. You're turning $52 into $10,000 from thin air. All right, Donahill continues. Oliver Cowdery wrote that men who were not thought to be worth $50 began to buy goods to the amount of thousands. You had $50, now you got thousands. Many families ran up great bills for clothing and merchandise, but prices rose outrageously. Yep, you print all this money, what happens? You had no money, you print all this money. Inflation, prices rose outrageously, pictured above Oliver. All right, let's talk about Max Parkin's conflict at Kirtland, 1966. I believe this was based on a MA thesis or a PhD dissertation. Mormon guy, went on, I think, to get a PhD, taught Institute at the University of Utah for a long time. He says the confidence that the saints had in the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company, resulting from the solicitation of Joseph Smith and other leaders, no doubt prompted many to invest in it, because Joseph Smith told them to, right? Okay, Max Parkin continues. He's pictured above. The saints demonstrated considerable optimism in the future of the bank and believed that it would eventually become a great financial institution. Right, because that's what Joseph said. Okay, Parkin continues. The fact that this confidence was principally derived from the prophet Joseph unfortunately led some saints to make the unfounded conclusion that the bank could not fail because of its divine approbation. Well, Joseph was saying it was going to be a success. He was saying he got a revelation about this, that they should start it. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to get a revelation that you should start a bank that fails. Okay, there can be no doubt that the prophet and others encouraged the saints to have confidence in the bank. Okay, let's go to a speech by Sidney Rigdon. He's in the First Presidency. This is recorded in Wilford Woodruff's journal, April 9th, 1837, so pretty close to the time of it happening. We have a picture of Rigdon above. So Rigdon says the presidency had used every means for the deliverance of the church, but as many of the church had refused Kirtland currency, which was their temporal salvation, in consequence of this they put strength in the hands of their enemies, and those that had done this thing must suffer by it. So many people in the church refusing Kirtland currency, kind of like everybody else, right? And so Rigdon is blaming probably the failure of the bank on them. Oh, they're refusing to accept it. If they would have accepted it, this would have been their temporal salvation. But the bank was not to be. Okay, let's go to a speech from the prophet Joseph Smith, same day in Wilford Woodruff's journal. Yea, in the name of God, Joseph proclaimed that severe judgment awaited those characters that professed to be his friends, but I guess weren't, and friends to humanity, and the Kirtland Safety Society, those who professed to be. Okay, Joseph Smith continues here in this speech. But they had turned traitors and opposed the currency. Those who are not accepting the currency are now traitors. And its friends, which has given power into the hands of the enemy and oppressed the poor saints. So he blames it on the saints. He goes, you guys that wouldn't accept the currency, it's not my fault that the bank failed. Such of these have become covenant breakers. These traitors, those that oppose the currency, those that wouldn't accept the currency, have become covenant breakers, for which they will feel the wrath of God as Joseph, or as true as Joseph is a prophet. All right, so back to Max Parkin and conflict at Kirtland, 1966. The belief that this bank could become a prominent financial organization began to circulate among the saints and apparently was the cause for increased confidence in it. Okay, Parkin continues. Likewise, early in the year, word began to circulate that the bank was established by divine revelation. All right, Parkin continues. On January 27th, 1837, the Painesville Telegraph printed a letter over the unidentified signature of Cervantes, quote unquote, to the effect that the Kirtland Bank was established by revelation. And a guy named Dean A. Dudley put out an article in the Journal of Economic History, 1970, and he actually called his journal article "The Bank Born of Revelation, the Kirtland Safety Society Anti-Banking Company." Okay, the historian Herbert Howe Bancroft, in his History of Utah 1882, also said that this bank was established by revelation. This is also in William Alexander Lynn book, The Story of the Mormons, 1902. So Bancroft says subsequently they had a revelation. Another says commanding them to establish a bank which would swallow up all other banks. And we'll get to the original source for this. Bancroft is pictured above. Okay, we can get to a statement here from the Apostle John F. Boynton, pictured above. He said that it was his understanding that the bank was instituted by the will of God and that it should never fail. So this was minutes of a conference assembled in committee of the whole church at Kirtland on September 3rd, 1837. The source is History of the Church, Volume 2, pages 509 and 510. The Apostle John F. Boynton again rose and still attributed his difficulties to the failure of the bank, stating that he understood the bank was instituted by the will of God, and he had been told that it should never fail. Who told him that? Probably Joseph Smith, right? Let men do what they would. All right, so the prophet Joseph Smith stands up and responds to Apostle Boynton. And as usual, he has an excuse why the revelation failed. He said that unless the institution was conducted on righteous principles, that it would not stand. So not him, right? Other people involved in the bank didn't conduct bank business on righteous principles. So let's read the whole thing here. Same source. President Joseph Smith then arose and stated that if this had been declared, no one had authority from him for so doing. That the bank was the will of God, I guess. For he had always said, and I don't think this is true, he had always said that unless the institution was conducted on righteous principles, it would not stand. Pictured above, Joseph with his top hat and his little stone. I think that stone's actually bigger than that. All right, so here's a pretty good primary source from the Mormon dissenter and bank cashier Warren Parrish, Painesville, Republican, February 22, 1838. So not too long after the fact. I have listened to him, Joseph Smith, with feelings of no ordinary kind, when he declared that the audible voice of God instructed him to establish a banking/anti-banking institution. Joseph Smith said that it was the audible voice of God that instructed him to establish the bank. All right, Warren Parrish continues here in February of 1838. Who, like Aaron's rod, shall swallow up all other banks, the Bank of Monroe excepted. I think the church had some relationship with the Bank of Monroe. And they would grow and flourish and spread from the rivers to the ends of the earth and survive when all others should be laid in ruins. Kind of sounds like Joseph Smith, right? Kind of sounds like the passages we read in the Doctrine and Covenants at the beginning of this video, that Kirtland was supposed to become this great city with steamboats and railroads and roads paved with gold, and kings and queens would come to Kirtland. No, it didn't happen. And pictured above, we have Aaron's rod, and it looks like he's wearing the Urim and Thummim. Okay, another source here from Warren Parrish, Letter to the Zion's Watchman, March 24th, 1838, so pretty early on. I, Warren, have been astonished to hear Joseph Smith declare that we had 60,000 in specie in our vaults. We know that's not true. From other sources, we know it was only 20,000 in specie. And Joseph supposedly said we had $600,000 at our command. Was that in Kirtland banknotes, I guess? When we had not to exceed 6,000 in specie and could not command any more. So maybe at this time it was around 6,000. It got up to 20,000. I don't know. But it certainly wasn't 60,000 as Joseph Smith was stating here. So Joseph Smith was lying. Okay, another pretty good source here about the bank being a revelation from Oliver H. Olney. He was a 70 about this time. He was John Johnson Sr.'s son-in-law. Put out a little pamphlet or a little book called Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed, 1843. So Olney says capital stock was called for, the books were opened, capitalists came forward and showed their goodwill to establish a bank, as it was said to be a revelation from God to do it. All right, Oliver H. Olney continues. That did many surprise, as their bank was said to be established by a revelation from God. Many contended that it could not be put down by man. What lasted a month? All right, Wilford Woodruff talks about the bank being a revelation to start in his journal, January 6, 1837. He says, I also heard President Joseph Smith Jr. declare in the presence of Frederick Williams, David Whitmer, Samuel Smith, and Warren Parrish, all listening, I guess, and others in the deposit office, that Joseph had received that morning the word of the Lord upon the subject of the Kirtland Safety Society. What was the word of the Lord? Well, they started the thing, right? So we kind of know what the word of the Lord was. Warren Parrish was here listening to President Joseph Smith. He said in other accounts that there was definitely a revelation to start the bank. And here in Wilford Woodruff's journal, that it confirms that. But he was there listening to Joseph Smith, and he received the word of the Lord. We're going to keep quoting this entry on the next slides. But pictured above, the new version of the Wilford Woodruff Journals, edited by Dan Vogel, put out by Benchmark Books, only in hard copy right now. Has a few additions to the original version of the journals. I'm just waiting for that to come out on Kindle or e-copy. Okay, same entry in Wilford Woodruff's journal, January 6, 1837, right in the heart of this time frame. So Joseph Smith is telling this story, and he says that he, Joseph, was alone in a room by himself, and he had not only heard the voice of the Spirit upon the subject, but even an audible voice of what to do in regard to this bank. Start it, don't start it, what should we do? Remember, Warren Parrish also said that Joseph Smith received an audible voice giving him the revelation. So that's also a confirmation from source to source here. Okay, Wilford continues in the same entry. He, Joseph, did not tell us at that time what the Lord said upon the subject, but remarked that if we would give heed to the commandments that the Lord had given this morning, that all would be well. Well, we know the end result, because we know the history of what happened. Joseph did start the bank, so we can be pretty sure what that audible voice was telling him to do. Wilford pictured above. All right, this entry continues. Seems that this is Wilford in his own voice speaking. May the Lord bless Brother Joseph with all the saints, and support the above-named institution, and protect it so that every weapon formed against it may be broken and come to naught, while the Kirtland Safety Society shall become the greatest of all institutions on earth. All right, what does it say in Saints Volume 1, put out in 2018? It says, Joseph felt that God approved of their efforts in establishing the bank. Joseph felt, he had a feeling, that God approved of their efforts in establishing the bank. So they don't quite come out and say revelation. They kind of hint at it. And he promised that all would be well if the saints heeded the Lord's commandments. Very similar to what Wilford Woodruff said in his journal, right? Yep. Trusting the prophet's word, additional saints invested in the Safety Society. So they're going partway to the truth. And then they list as a source this Wilford Woodruff journal entry, January 6, 1837, that we just read. Of course, they don't read the whole, they don't put the whole thing in to the Saints book because that's probably too controversial for them. They want to word it in their own carefully worded manner. All right, the Saints, Volume 1 continues. When Joseph Smith's statements about the Safety Society appeared to go unfulfilled, just his statements, you know, they weren't revelations, but it was approved by God, very carefully worded. His statements about the Safety Society appeared to go unfulfilled because, of course, the bank failed, and their investments began to slip away. Many saints became uneasy and critical of Joseph. All right, statement from John D. Lee, who became a member of the Mormon Church around this time in 1837. Later on put out The Mormonism Unveiled, The Life and Confession of John D. Lee, and The Complete Life of Brigham Young in 1881. So a late account, but he also says that it was a revelation. The poor saints, although losing many of them all of their hard-earned savings, not all, it wasn't as bad as he's putting forth here, but they definitely lost some savings by investing in the Kirtland Bank. They were still loyal to their leader, Joseph Smith, and excused him on the ground that he had lost the spirit for the time, and the revelation was not of divine origin. But there was this idea that it was a revelation, even up here into Utah in 1881. Of course, John D. Lee was the scapegoat for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Mormons always need a scapegoat. All right, so after reading all those accounts stating that it is a revelation to start this bank by Joseph Smith, what do you think the church is going to do? They want to counteract it. They want to do apologetics against that. Makes Joseph Smith look bad. So they get this guy, R. McKay White, to do a talk and a paper at the Fair Mormon Conference in 2009 called The Kirtland Safety Society, The Myths, the Facts, and the Prophet's Good Name. He's pictured above. He's now a professor at MacEwan University. I'm not sure how you say that. MacEwan University in Canada. But they got him to make some pretty blatant statements. I guess he's not aware of all the accounts that we've given previous to this slide, because White says that the Safety Society was not based on revelation. There was no direction from the Lord to establish it. Joseph Smith did not start it in his capacity as a prophet. Well, he's even disagreeing here with what they put in the Saints book. But yeah, I think we definitely have enough sources to say that it was a revelation, and he's just doing bad apologetics. All right, so R. McKay White continues here in this Fair Mormon Conference. Latter-day Saints do not believe that their leaders are infallible. I always like to bring that out. Given the Safety Society was not directed by God, yes it was, and that Joseph Smith was subject to mortal weaknesses and failings, there was always a chance that the Safety Society would not succeed. Well, if Kirtland, Ohio was supposed to be the New Zion, they were going to build the temple there. It was even supposed to be the place where the Lord came back to. You would want to create a healthy economy, right? Well, this bank, established by the direction of God, by revelation, completely tanked the economy. and they had to leave Kirtland. And of course, it was not Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's fault, right? Even though they're the ones that established it, even though they're the ones that ran it, even though the Smith family had 33% of the shares. All right, R. McKay White continues here. Failure, however, would have no bearing on his calling as a prophet. Well, it did to a lot of saints and even half of the apostles, which we'll get to. Furthermore, as will be established, the failure had nothing to do with Joseph Smith or Sidney Rigdon. The Safety Society failed because of the poor use of agency of others. Scapegoat, right? The poor use of agency of others, not the ones who started the bank. All right, we have some more apologetics from the Mormon historian Elizabeth Kewen, pictured above. LDS Perspectives podcast in 2017. They ask her the question, is it correct that Joseph Smith prophesied that the Kirtland Safety Society would be successful? So they use the word prophesied, not revelation. Did he prophesy that it would be successful? Well, we have some accounts that said, yes, he did prophesy that. What is her answer, though? She says, that's a really interesting question, and technically he did not. He did not prophesy that it would be successful. I'll go back to some of the other accounts that we read, and we find some disagreement in opinions there. All right, we have some bad apologetics from Terrell and Fiona Givens in The Crucible of Doubt, 2014. He talks about Joseph Smith's pronouncements on the Kirtland Bank, which were as liable to error as any other men. Maybe Givens knows about his statements that he said it was a revelation, that he prophesied that it would succeed, that kind of a thing. I'm not sure. He doesn't say what Joseph Smith's pronouncements on the Kirtland Bank were or are. He just talks about this weird idea of prophetic authority. So Terrell and Fiona Givens says, when not speaking with prophetic authority, in other words, he claimed no authority at all, which is why his pronouncements on the Kirtland Bank were as liable to error as other men's, because he wasn't speaking with prophetic authority at that time, right? Well, others thought he was. He's hearing the audible voice of God, according to Wilford Woodruff and according to Warren Parrish. The audible voice of God is not prophetic authority. No authority at all. Mormon leaders, like the great souls of other religious traditions, are never assured an unvarying inspiration when they speak or write. I guess they have lapses, right? Or sometimes they give revelations with no prophetic authority at all. Okay, some more Mormon apologetics, maybe even some just outright lies here. This is from the Mormon writer Alexa Erickson. She put out a book called 1001 Facts About the Prophet Joseph Smith at Cedar Fort Press, 2018. Cedar Fort Press is a Mormon press owned by a Mormon guy. So Alexa Erickson says Joseph handled the day-to-day affairs of the bank, but had no control over big decisions made regarding the bank. He had no control over big decisions. This is just out-and-out bullshit. All right, here's another story that Alexa Erickson mentions, and she's pictured above. After working at the bank for a while, Warren Parrish accused Joseph of counterfeiting banknotes in exchange for money, whatever that means. Then Joseph accused Parrish of the same, of counterfeiting banknotes for money. All right, same source here, Mormon writer Alexa Erickson. Historians have recently discovered stock ledgers from the Kirtland Safety Society Bank records that demonstrate that Warren Parrish was responsible for the counterfeited banknotes. Bullshit. I challenge anybody to find this on the stock ledgers. I haven't heard anything about it. Okay, Joseph Smith giving some more excuses about why the bank failed. This is a Mary Fielding letter to Mercy Fielding Thompson around 1837, June. Joseph Smith had said that as many of the bank directors are become unfaithful, he does not know that it will rise again, that is, the bank, because the bank directors, of course, were not faithful. Joseph Smith further said that the Kirtland Bank could never succeed while some pull one way and some another. That's not why it failed. Because it requires the united efforts of all, and when this will be the case, the Lord only knows. But if people don't believe that it's a real bank, if they don't believe in the currency, then the banks fail, right? And the only people that believed in it were the very local community around Kirtland. Most of the rest of the country didn't accept these notes. All right, some interesting information about kind of fraudulent activities within the bank. This is an interview with C.G. Webb, April 1885, in Dr. W. Wiles' Mormon Portraits, 1886. C.G. Webb was a 70 around this time frame, 1837. So Webb says, in the bank they kept 8 or 9 window glass boxes which seemed to be full of silver. Seemed to be. But the initiated knew very well that they were full of sand, and only the top being covered with 50-cent pieces. Because they really didn't have a lot of coin, right? They didn't have a lot of 50-cent pieces in there, so they just put it on the top, and the rest of the box was filled with sand. All right, C.G. Webb continues here. The effect of those boxes was like magic. They created general confidence in the solidity of the bank, and that beautiful paper money, the Kirtland notes, went like hotcakes. For about a month, it was the best money in the country. Only for a month. Okay, a similar story from a Cyrus Smalling of Kirtland, Ohio. This is a letter to Mr. Lee of Frankford, March 10th, 1841, so a lot earlier than the last account. This is in John A. Clark's book, Gleanings by the Way, 1842. Now, Cyrus Smalling was 70 and a clerk to Joseph Smith. So Smalling says, the inhabitants holding their bills came to inquire into the Safety Society. Precious metals came to inquire. The way that Joseph Smith contrived to deceive them was this, and we'll get that on the next slide. Okay, Cyrus Smalling continues. Joseph Smith had some 100 or 200 boxes made. That's a lot, 200 boxes. And gathered all the lead and shot that the village had, or that part of it that he controlled, right? Because lead and shot is heavy, like coin. And filled the boxes with lead, shot, etc., and marked them $1,000 each. All right, Cyrus Smalling continues. Then, when they went to examine the vault, Joseph had one box on a table partly filled for them to see, and when they proceeded to the vault, Joseph Smith told them that the church had $200,000 in specie. That's a lie. They only had about 20,000. They did not have 200,000. And Joseph opened one box, and they saw that it was silver, at least on the top, right? And they hefted a number of the boxes. And Joseph Smith told them that they contained specie, or silver, or coin. Okay, Cyrus Smalling continues here. You can see the title page for the book this is in. Gleanings by the Way in 1842. They were seemingly satisfied and went away for a few days until the elders were sent off in every direction to pass their paper off, trying to get, goods and services, or trying to trade it, for real money, like coin, gold, silver, whatever. All right, Oliver H. Olney also talked about this issue. Remember, Olney was John Johnson Sr.'s son-in-law. This is in a book called Absurdities of Mormonism Portrayed, 1843, so pretty early on. As peddlers went to and fro from the Kirtland Bank, gold and silver began to be scarce. They got hold of a quantity of boxes and nearly filled them with sand, lead, old iron, stone, and combustibles, and covered it up with clean coin. So you can see sand here. You can see, what is it? Is that lead? I'm not sure what I put in there. Or iron. And stone here pictured above. All right, I got a new book here called The Writings of Oliver H. Olney, April 1842 to February 1843, Nauvoo, Illinois, edited by Richard G. Moore. Book came out in 2019. They gathered up, the papers of Oliver H. Olney, and this is a new account that most historians don't have yet. Olney says, as regarding the bank, he says, they had boxes in abundance that they filled with sand well near the top, and then put on the clean coin that made a fair prospect. Put on the clean coin, on the top, covering the sand. And here's the cover of this book. Okay, same source here, The Writings of Oliver H. Olney, 2019 book by Cofford Books. The Kirtland Bank prophecy failed. So here Olney again talks about this Kirtland Bank being a prophecy, or being a revelation, you could say. This prophecy failed and caused many to mourn, all in the name of the Lord. I suppose that they had wisdom, as they much of it did boast, but alas, their bank failed for the want of specie to back it up. Silver coin, basically. All right, some interesting information about the prophet Joseph Smith starting up this bank here. This is in the Messenger and Advocate, January 1837. Also shows up in the Articles of Agreement for the Kirtland Safety Society, Anti-Banking Company, January 2nd, 1837, in the Joseph Smith Papers. Prophet Joseph Smith says, in connection with the above Articles of Agreement, which you can go read on the Joseph Smith Papers website, the Articles of Agreement of the Kirtland Safety Society, we invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and take stock in our safety society. So here's Joseph Smith doing marketing for the bank. We invite the brethren from abroad to call on us and take stock in our safety society. Okay, going to a speech by Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith's brother, in the Wilford Woodruff Journal, April 6, 1837. Also that we must keep in view the institution of the Kirtland Safety Society, and if the elders of Israel would be faithful and do what was in their power, this once Kirtland should speedily be redeemed and become a stronghold not to be thrown down. Well, I guess the elders of Israel were not faithful, right? Because Kirtland was not redeemed and did not become a stronghold, and they left. Hiram, pictured above. All right, here's a source from Dan Vogel's new book, Charisma Under Pressure, 2023, Vogel pictured above. This is a C. All we know is that their name abbreviated as C. Letter to the editor, February 16, 1837, in the Ohio Observer. About this time, reports began to circulate that Sidney Rigdon refused to redeem banknotes for specie. Had too much notes coming in, not enough specie to redeem them. According to one resident of Kirtland, the Mormons continued to redeem with specie for 10 days. They didn't have a lot, though, just kind of covering the tops, right? And then they had to shut up shop. So they were only able to redeem notes for specie for a short amount of time. Okay, another source in the Cleveland Daily Gazette, January 24th, 1837. A piece of news for the Herald Mormon Safety Society Notes is the article name. The Cleveland Daily Gazette reported on January 24th that the Mormon Bank got tired of redeeming their bills yesterday. So once this happens, the bank folds. All right, 2 days later, the Cleveland Weekly Gazette reported that the day before yesterday, the Kirtland Safety Society refused to cash its phantom money, as we were credibly informed. Couldn't redeem the notes for specie or for coin. They refused to cash its phantom money. This is February 1st, 1837. All right, Joseph Smith sees the writing on the wall and resigns from the bank. Sometime previous to this, I, Joseph Smith, resigned my office in the Kirtland Safety Society, disposed of my interest therein, and withdrew from the institution. This is January 7, 1837, in the History of the Church, Volume 2. All right, same source here from Joseph Smith, giving more excuses why it failed. Being fully aware after so long an experiment, a month, that no institution of the kind established upon just and righteous principles for a blessing not only to the church but the whole nation would be suffered to continue its operations in such an age of darkness, speculation, and wickedness. The Lord wouldn't allow it to continue, right, because of an age of darkness, speculation, and wickedness, I guess. Yeah, and it has to be conducted upon just and righteous principles, but all right, another statement from Mark L. Staker in Hearken, O Ye People. Joseph attributed the Kirtland Safety Society's failure to the members' lack of unity and mutual support, but that's not why it failed. All right, and then in August 1837, Joseph Smith makes another statement in the Messenger and Advocate, Volume 3. Caution to the brethren and friends of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Notice it's a different name than now. I, Joseph Smith, am disposed to say a word relative to the bills of the Kirtland Safety Society Bank. Okay, the prophet Joseph continues, basically saying that Kirtland banknotes are now have no value. I, Joseph, hereby warn them to beware of speculators, renegados, and gamblers who are duping the unsuspecting and the unwary by palming upon them those Kirtland bank bills which are of no worth here. Kirtland bank bills of no worth. Pictured above, we got a renegado, I guess. All right, the prophet Joseph continues. I, Joseph, discountenance and disapprove of any and all such practices. I know them to be detrimental to the best interests of society, as well as to the principles of religion. So now these notes are worthless. All right, let's go to some information in Robert Kent Fielding's PhD dissertation, Indiana University, 1957, The Growth of the Mormon Church in Kirtland, Ohio. It was natural that blame for the entire situation should be charged against the prophet. It's natural. They had gathered to Kirtland at his command. The idea of purchasing housing lots in the great subdivision scheme had his full support. All right, Fielding continues in his dissertation. Joseph had inferred that the bank would not only succeed, but would one day be the most powerful institution of its kind. We've gone over sources that say that. There had been conditions stated upon which these salutary results were predicated, but they were general rather than specific, and we've gone over those as well. And the church populace was genuinely disillusioned when the bank failed, right? Because of Joseph Smith's prophecies about it and his revelations about it, and his prophecies and revelations about Kirtland in general and the Kirtland economy. Okay, Fielding continues here. It was difficult for them to comprehend that a man who claimed to have divine revelation in religious matters could fail so miserably in economic affairs. Okay, no amount of shifting of blame, which we've gone over, could obscure the fact that a prophet had failed in a grand project, which caused the Kirtland economy to tank. And the project of building Zion, building the temple, preparing Kirtland to be the place of the second coming, all this fails because of this bank. All right, Robert Kent Fielding continues in his PhD dissertation, Indiana University, 1957. As the sheriff appeared ever more regularly with summons, and as the fortunes and anticipations of one after another of the leaders faced the humiliating prospect of publicly acknowledged incompetence, and bankruptcy, the discipline and sense of responsibility, which are the heart of all organizations, broke completely and plunged Mormondom into ecclesiastical anarchy. A lot of people leaving, a lot of general authorities and apostles leaving, which we'll get to. All right, Fielding continues. By far the most serious case adjudged against the prophet at this term of court was that of Samuel D. Rounds for illegal banking. Okay, Joseph Smith's attorney had filed a demurrer from the declaration of the plaintiff, but was overruled by the court, and the case was tried by a jury in October of 1837. All right, Fielding continues. The prophet was represented by counsel, and the basis of the defense was that the Kirtland Safety Society was an association formed to conduct mercantile and other enterprises, not to operate a bank. Well, they tried to pretend that it was that, a mercantile and other enterprises, but it really wasn't. It was operating as a bank. All right, Fielding continues. The jury awarded the judgment to the plaintiff, so that goes against Joseph. And the defendant, Joseph, filed a bill of exceptions on minor points, which the court regarded as technicalities, not sufficient to overrule the decision. So there was a judgment against Joseph. All right, the jury declared that a bank had been operated contrary to law and ordered Joseph Smith to pay a fine of $1,000 plus costs, I guess, attorney costs. Here we got a $1,000 bill. President Cleveland on there. Never seen one of those, actually. All right, Fielding continues. Similar findings were returned against Sidney Rigdon, but the cases against Whitney and Parrish for the same offense were discontinued. So, yeah, both Joseph and Rigdon, I think, had to pay a $1,000 fine for breaking the law for running an illegal bank. Okay, the editors of the Joseph Smith papers talk about this court case in Documents Volume 5, pictured above, or you can just go to the website and look this up, the josephsmithpapers.org website. Two events in February significantly affected the development of the Kirtland Safety Society and its ability to gain public support. First, Samuel D. Rounds brought charges against Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Warren Parrish, Newell K. Whitney, Frederick G. Williams, and Horace Kingsbury under an 1816 Ohio statute that made it a finable offense for an unchartered bank to perform banking services, including the issuing of notes. All right, so here's where the Joseph Smith papers editors kind of massage the data, try to make it seem, well, it wasn't as illegal as maybe you thought it was. The editor's kind of doing some apologetics here. So they say public understanding of Ohio banking laws in 1837 was muddled. Well, the jury didn't think so in the court case. And there was disagreement regarding the enforcement of the 1816 statute. Statute, is that how you say that? In large part due to an 1824 statute that had prohibited lawsuits against the notes of unauthorized or unincorporated banks. All right, so let's take a look at some of the wording of this 1816 law of Ohio. This shows up in William Alexander Lynn's book, The Story of Mormonism, 1902. The 1816 law of Ohio provided that all notes and bills, bonds, and other securities of an unchartered bank, which the Kirtland one was, all these notes shall be held and taken in all courts as absolutely void, of no value, right? Absolutely void. Bills, bonds, and securities. All right, back to the Joseph Smith papers. The legal disjuncture between the two statutes was not formally resolved until 1840. Though the other four church members were not prosecuted, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were tried in absentia in October 1837. So they're tried by jury in their absence, Joseph and Rigdon's absence. All right. Documents, Volume 5, Joseph Smith Papers. In the trials, the court charged the jury that said the statute was in force. So the jury said the statute was in force, the 1816 law. And Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon were both found guilty according to the Act of 1816 and fined $1,000 each. So here's where they're agreeing with Fielding. And they give some of the references here, I guess, for these court cases. They say there was trials, more than one trial. Okay, let's go to another source by Gary Dean Guthrie. He did his MA thesis at BYU in 1969 called Joseph Smith as an Administrator. He says the blame of the bank failure fell heavily on Joseph. He had issued a formal invitation to his followers to take stock in the venture, which we read, and the institution had been organized outside of the law. Okay, Guthrie continues here. 6 of the apostles came out in open rebellion, so half of them. Joseph had a huge mutiny on his hands here. Joseph first established the bank by revelation, and then had to later admit that because of poor management and other internal and external conditions, the project was a failure. Okay, William Shepard and H. Michael Marquardt talk about this too in Lost Apostles book, 2014. More than half of the apostles and other leading men called for Joseph Smith to step down. Okay, same book by Shepard and Marquardt, Lost Apostles. It was Joseph Smith's fault because he should have known better, so the logic went. It was a difficult conclusion to avoid. Difficult conclusion to avoid, according to Shepard and Marquardt, who were pictured above here. Okay, going back to Max Parkin, Conflict at Kirtland, 1966. The prophet who had led some to believe that the bank could grow into a significant national institution was held responsible for much of the economic discontent. The bank became a financial failure. Okay, so a lot of important members of the church became disaffected because of this whole bank problem. Max Parkin continues here. Considerable animosity towards Joseph Smith developed among the saints, including a number of the most prominent leaders in the church, such as President Frederick G. Williams, I guess in the First Presidency, the apostles Lyman E. Johnson, Luke S. Johnson, and John F. Boynton. All 3 of those apostles started showing animosity towards Joseph Smith and becoming disaffected. And the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon were pissed off. Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, as pictured above. Okay, some other dissenters included the 70s, Hazen Aldrich, Leonard Rich, Sylvester Smith, John Gold, and John Grayson, all 70s, I guess. This from BYU professor Alexander L. Bow in a chapter in a book called Joseph Smith, the Prophet and the Seer, put out by BYU. Okay, a source here, W. Weil, Mormon Portraits, 1886, talks about Joseph's grammar teacher who personally lost $2,500 in the bank. He got for my money the blessing of the Lord. Not sure what that meant. Joseph blessed him and lost his $2,500 though. And he also got the assurance that by and by the notes of that bank would be the best money in the country. That never quite happened. Although nowadays the notes are very valuable. So I guess the prophecy was fulfilled, right? Okay, a writer in the Improvement era, March 1961, talked about this as well. Earl Hansen, Money of the Mountains. At the time the Kirtland Safety Society closed its doors, Joseph Smith prophesied that the notes would one day be as good as gold, which later came true, he says. All right, Milton V. Backman put out a book called Heavens Resound, 1983. Can't remember if we've quoted from this yet. But he says, between November 1837 and June 1838, possibly 200 or 300 Kirtland saints withdrew from the church. So that's significant. This represented about 10 to 15% of the membership there. Many of the apostates had served in major positions of responsibility, which we've already gone over. Okay, Bachman continues. During a 9-month period, almost 1/3 of the general authorities were excommunicated, disfellowshipped, or removed from their church callings. 1/3. That's significant. So this banking crisis had far-reaching effects. Bachman pictured above. All right, Roger D. Lanius talks about this in the Kirtland Temple, a historical narrative book in 1986. We've gone over some of this, but he says, included in the apostasy were the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, 4 members of the Quorum of the 12, 3 original presidents, and 3 current presidents of the 70, as well as Frederick G. Williams, a member of the First Presidency. So, very significant. God should have told Joseph not to start this bank. Okay, we're going to go back to Fawn Brody, No Man Knows My History, to wrap things up here for this video. Been going a little over 2 hours so far. The toppling of the Kirtland Bank loosed a hornet's nest. Creditors swarmed in upon Joseph, armed with threats and warrants. He was terribly in debt. Okay, Brody continues. There is no way of knowing exactly how much Joseph and his leading elders had borrowed, since the loyal Mormons left no itemized account of their own claims. But the local non-Mormon creditors whom he could not repay brought a series of lawsuits against the prophet, which the Geauga County Court duly recorded. Okay, Brody continues. These records tell a story of trouble that would have demolished the prestige and broken the spirit of a lesser man. 13 lawsuits were brought against Joseph between June 1837 and April 1839 to collect sums totaling nearly $25,000. So Joseph Smith went through a lot in his life, didn't he? Okay, Brody continues. The damages asked for amounted to almost $35,000. Joseph was arrested 7 times in 4 months, and his followers managed heroically to raise the $38,000 required for bail. Joseph Smith arrested 7 times in 4 months. Okay, of the 13 lawsuits, only 6 of them were settled out of court, about $12,000 out of the $25,000. In the other 7 lawsuits, the creditors either were awarded damages or they won them by default. All right, Brody continues in No Man Knows My History, 1945, still one of the best biographies of Joseph. Joseph had many additional debts that never resulted in court action. Some years later, he compiled a list of still outstanding Kirtland loans, which amounted to more than $33,000. Okay, if one adds to these the 2 great loans of $30,000 and $60,000 borrowed in New York and Buffalo in 1836, it would seem that the Mormon leaders owed to the non-Mormon individuals and firms well over $150,000, which is a lot of money in 2023. All right, Brody continues. In the spring of 1841, Joseph cataloged a list of his outstanding liabilities, cataloged them, and found them to be a total of over $70,000, in addition to another $33,000 carried over from the Kirtland days. What's that, $103,000 total. Okay, Brody continues here in her summary of the aftermath of the Kirtland Bank fiasco. It is not surprising, therefore, that Joseph looked with interest upon the bankruptcy law that Congress had passed in 1841 to relieve the straits of the debtor class. Pictured above, we have a commentary on the bankruptcy law of 1841. All right, if you don't trust Fawn Brody, because she's a mean anti-Mormon critic, go to Gordon A. Madsen, lawyer, member of the church, editor of the Joseph Smith Papers, of the legal documents. He did a chapter in a book Chapter is called Tabulating the Impact of Litigation on the Kirtland Economy in the book Sustaining the Law, Joseph Smith's Legal Encounters, put out by Jeffrey N. Walker and John W. Welch, BYU Studies, 2014, cover pictured above. So Madsen says, between June and December of 1837, Joseph Smith would be involved as a defendant or co-defendant in 13 lawsuits for collection of debts, as well as 14 other lawsuits that would be filed following his departure to Missouri in January. So, yeah, they went from Kirtland, Ohio over to Missouri. All right, Gordon A. Madsen's going to tabulate all the people that Joseph Smith owed. Legal historian Gordon Madsen summarized these. Joseph Smith was sued by 2 banks, 5 New York City merchants, 2 Buffalo merchants, 1 Painesville merchant, 2 Kirtland landowners, the engraver who made the plates for printing Safety Society banknotes. So I guess they didn't even have enough money to pay the engraver. And a Joseph Coe, who supplied 1/3 of the money to purchase the Egyptian papyri and mummies. They couldn't even pay him his 1/3 to buy the Egyptian papyri, among other smaller claimants. So Joseph Smith and the church basically in dire straits. All right, in reviewing the lawsuits for collection of debts against Joseph Smith between June 1837 and October 1842, the legal historian Gordon Madsen estimated that Joseph Smith owed $34,000 as well as another $13,000 through the connection to the Temple Committee and $4,500 mortgage on the temple for a total debt of $52,000. Looks like they were kind of borrowing money for everything that they needed around this time. Okay, Madsen continues. He's pictured above. Madsen determined that $45,600, or 87% of this, had been discontinued, settled, or satisfied. What does discontinued mean? Just not paid. Leaving an outstanding debt of $6,600. Much of the debt was paid after the Saints had abandoned Kirtland, mostly from the transfer and tithing of Kirtland property. All right, and that's it. We went 2 hours, 15 minutes, so not super long, but I think just long enough to cover this topic in a lot of detail and a lot of depth. What do you think? Was it a major crisis? Should Joseph Smith have never started this bank? Why did God tell him to start this bank when it caused so much trouble? But anyway, that's going to do it for this video, and I thank you for watching the Kirtland Safety Society Bank Crisis video.